so much of what we have talked about in the past about designing churches and working through this is the idea of children's programs, connecting with families, connecting with kids. That's a huge driver. And another what if question, how do you think that is going to change relative to that? Because demographically, kids certainly we've always saw them differently in a church environment, and so
I'm convinced that's still going to be what drives people to your physical location. So that's where I would say if you're going to delineate who's going to be more likely to stay home versus who's not, because here's the deal. I've got kids. I've got 3. I've got an 11-year-old, an 8-year-old, and currently a 5-year-old.
Sure.
And we've done online church for months, and so we've been pretty diligent about sit down, it's your turn, watch it. Right. And it was interesting because early on they were like, this is cool, this is exciting, we're going to dance, we're going to sing, we're listening. Sure. We'd check the Bible verse, do you know this verse? And they'd be like, we know it. I'm like, this is working, this is cool. As time has gone on, there's been less and less excitement to sit down in the living room and watch this program. We're losing some of that momentum that you have early on. And so the reality is I think that you're going to find more and more people are going to come back to physical locations who have kids, and that might draw the question of, you can't skimp on the kids stuff. You might be able to skimp on adult programming, believe it or not. You won't be able to skimp on kids. And so I'm convinced that churches moving forward are going to have to put more emphasis, time, and money into the kids programs and kids spaces than they are maybe into the adults, because you'll have adults that have a choice to go, are you going to offer that class online? We'll watch online. Yeah. If you're doing it just for adults. Those that have kids, I think you're going to be more likely to be like, you know what, we can't do this online thing. 1, for our sanity.
Sure.
2, because our kids aren't going to get what we want them to experience. In fact, I know a lot of people that aren't even really sold out to God. They're not sold out to Christ, but they have this crisis moment when their kids start to get 3, 4, 5, and they grew up in the church. I want my kids to grow up in the church. And I'm always like, I don't know what you believe for sure, but you want your kids to grow up in the church. Yep. I'm like, okay, cool. And I think that will still be a driving factor for people to come to churches. So I think we might actually find that we spend more money on the kids spaces than we actually spend in the adult spaces.
In the adult spaces.
That's my guess.
Yeah. And so I guess it becomes a balance of how do you bridge that gap between the folks that really love the connection of church. The idea, growing up in a smaller church, I really feel like that the people that were there were my neighbors, and that was the one time when I got to see them.
Sure.
And this idea of the gathering spaces really became a huge deal relative to the more modern church, if you will. And so how do we create that? How do you think we can create that sort of mixing pot of outside of worship? Yeah. That sort of third space, if you will.
I don't think you can lose it in the church. So in the physical location, you're going to still have to do third space, because I don't care, even if we're still wearing masks 10 years from now. If we become like China and we wear them everywhere, even if that happens, people are still going to desire connectivity. Yeah. They're still going to want. So third space can't be. You can't negate it. You can't forget it. You're going to have it. But I think when it comes to online church, the thing you're going to have to realize is that we're no longer needing third space, because we're going to have to convince people that they're now in charge of their third space.
Sure. And
I think that's going to be the trend we'll see in the next 10 years, is my guess. I could be wrong. I think you're going to see more and more churches start watch parties and say, hey, listen, if you really like what we're doing online and you don't live in our city, you don't live in our town, or you do and you don't want to come to the physical location, who are you inviting that you trust in your neighborhood? What neighbor are you inviting to come over and watch? And I think you'll see more and more, in a sense, house churches. They might be part of a corporate church, a large church, but they will find themselves in a space of saying, I'm going to create my own small church environment in my home. And I think you'll see more and more people doing that as time goes on.
Yeah. So do you think the idea of, small, there was this sort of trend of small groups being in individual houses, and then there's the idea that, well, maybe those small groups, and we had this discussion before, you have a very strong opinion about that, is, small groups coming to church. You see that trend? You see that, small groups coming to basically get out of their homes and meeting in small groups to do learning and teaching and that kind of thing. Do you think that's something that
it might just be for us? We've not seen that.
Okay.
We kind of see that people who get into a good small group, like one where it's healthy and it's vibrant and it's they enjoy doing it outside. The idea they're going to come into the church and use the church is not, and we've moved away from that. We don't have space for it. We allow it if they really want it, but for the most part, people are usually like, I think it's better in our home. It's easier in our home. And so we don't see a lot of that coming back into the church. Now, certain churches, they have their culture built around it where they got the space for it. And so it's, once again, it's back to know your people. If you've got a small group culture that they like being in the church together, that's going to be dependent on age, how long they've been in church. Those kind of things are going to drive those. That's going to depend on what you do with your space. And so some people might have less third space because they have to have small group space. And other people say, hey, we're going to get rid of all the small group space. We're going to have just third space.
Find your niche.
Find your niche. Yeah. Know your people.
Yeah.
Know your audience.
Absolutely.
And then I would also say build spaces that you can change.
Yeah.
I love the idea
Flexible.
of always open spaces. As much of a building you can build that doesn't have infrastructure that holds it up, as much as you can open a space up, because you can always build temporary walls. You can always add, you can take a third space and turn it into a small group space with glass, with plexiglass, with some staging. I mean, you can get creative. And that's what I love about your guys' companies. You can come in and go, hey, you got an open space.
Yep.
Sky's the limit. What do you want? And you can create in that.
We talk about that idea. It's always easier to make a big space smaller than a small space.
We'll have to remove that wall. We'll have to take out that infrastructure. We'll have to remove that support and build another support. It's like, no. But big open spaces,
and
do what you want when you want.
You got to do those. Yeah, absolutely.